All right, folks, this is our lecture on racism and white privilege. And so follow along in the lecture videos, and then I've got a bunch of other videos interspersed here. And before you do this lecture, you should make sure that you have already reviewed or seen the documentary Race, the Power of an Illusion, episode 3, The House You Live In. And so, because I'll be referencing that several times here. So at the end of the video, Dr. Beverly Tatum says, who's included in this picture? So when I teach in class, I bring a catalog for Christmas ornaments to class. And luckily, Google is going to help us out here. It's from the company called Personal Creations, because what they have is you can like select how many people in your family, and they write your names on it and stuff. So I want you to take a look at this picture here and think about Dr. Tatum's quote of who's included in this picture. And as you're seeing all the faces of the family members here, I want you to notice that they are mostly white, unless they are, let's see, we got some polar bears here. There's, let's see, I think I saw some stockings. So unless you want to be your family represented as animals or as objects, there are fewer folks represented in something like this in terms of being non-white or in terms of being a mixed race family. And I was alerted to this a few years ago by my friend who is white. Her husband is black and their children are mixed. And she said, she posted on Facebook and she talked about, do you know how hard it is to find a Christmas ornament that represents my family? And so ever since then, that's something that I often think about, who's included in this picture in terms of Christmas ornaments. But of course, we can think a lot more broadly than that. Dr. Tatum also says that if you have privilege, you don't really notice it. So maybe if you're one of the people represented in these pictures here, you don't realize that there are a bunch of folks who aren't represented. How many of you noticed when we examined the Halloween costumes last week, if you were looking at the PowerPoint I posted on Sakai, that all of the models were white? That's something that maybe some folks noticed and other folks didn't. Also from the documentary, John Powell says that we have to be uncomfortable with the present arrangement and willing to make the invisible visible. So that's what I am trying to do today in this lesson. All right, so our learning outcomes are to be able to define and describe racism and white privilege. And then secondly, at the end of the lecture, be able to interpret data regarding the negative effects of racism. So part 1 here, let's talk about racism and white privilege. And so I've got a picture of a coin here because racism and white privilege represents two sides of a coin. Racism is defined as the belief that members of separate races possess different and unequal traits. And as we talked about in the last couple lessons in this unit so far, race and the idea of separate races is really a socially constructed idea. White privilege, on the other hand, means the unearned advantages or privileges based on skin color. White privilege is invisible. It's about not having to think about race at all. When you're white, you grow up not really thinking about race for the most part. White privilege is the other side of racism. Advantages and disadvantages stem from the same racial structure. So we're talking about the disadvantages of racism, the advantages of white privilege. One thing that I asked you to do in your individual activity this week, but then also through thinking about in the video, was thinking about how was whiteness constructed. And so it was first defined as all free white persons in 1790, and then restrictively defined as only the Northern and Western Europeans. So there were white folks with white skin colors who didn't fit into being white. And then later, over time, it was reformulated into more of an umbrella category to incorporate those folks, and then now includes those previously who were not defined as white, such as Jewish folks, Irish folks, Italians, Poles, and Slavs. And so I like to highlight white privilege when we talk about racism, because so much of the time it's left out of the conversation of race. And calling attention to whiteness and the social construction of the categories of race helps us to understand how uneven the playing field is. I would say too that I left college really not knowing anything about race and inequality, and I was a sociology major. And I don't say that to knock my undergrad education, because I love my undergrad education, but I didn't know, and that is shameful. That is so ignorant of me, and I don't want you all to end up ignorant like I was. And so I want to make sure that we do talk about this. The other concept I want to talk about here is called white fragility. Maybe some of you have read about this before from D'Angelo, 2011. So white fragility means the discomfort white people feel when confronted with issues of racial inequality. And so this happens, whites experience these feelings of these feelings of discomfort, which, I mean, is really ironic, right? That folks who are not white are experiencing the actual oppression of race, and here we have a term to help us identify the ways that white people are feeling. But whites may feel that an environment becomes so intolerant that it triggers these defensive moves for them. White, or for us, I'm sorry, I'm white. I didn't know if you noticed. Such as we might become angry, fearful, guilty, or argumentative or silent. So this often happens because we white people, so I'm including myself in this, we live in an environment that protects us. So we come to expect that protection. We expect to be racially comfortable. But then that gives us a lowered ability to tolerate racial stress, such as being called out for like being racist. And so racism, in the way that I'm talking about it today, reflects the idea that whites are the dominant and powerful group in the United States, and that people of color suffer disadvantages because of the system. And this is really the critical race perspective in the critical race theory that I'm coming from today. So how do white people, learn white fragility? So there are several ways that D'Angelo points out in her article. So first of all, it has to do with segregation, that white people's interests are normalized and centralized. Like no one notices there aren't kids of color in a particular school, that the white majority is the dominant and the norm. And so whites get used to that. The second point is universalism and individualism. So we white folks are taught to believe that our perspectives are objective and represent reality, rather than including a diversity of valid perspectives and valid opinions, valid ways to think and do stuff. Third point here is that white people come to feel entitled to racial comfort. So like I said a few minutes ago, whites are usually comfortable, so they start to feel like they're entitled to being comfortable. So then when they start to feel uncomfortable, which like maybe some of you are feeling right now, which would be awesome, because when we're uncomfortable, we're about to learn something, right? So dive into the uncomfortableness. So we start to feel like we're entitled to this comfort, and so when we start to feel uncomfortable, we want to do something. Fourth point here, psychic freedom. So white people don't bear the burden of race, but again, this lack of burden is invisible, and so we're just used to not having to deal with it. And then finally, the final point on this slide is representation. White people are represented in everything, which gives them the message that they are valuable and included. And I think that you can draw from that people of color who are not represented in everything get the message that they are not valuable and that they are not included. So jumping back to that idea of the Christmas ornaments there. White folks are represented, and white folks probably don't notice that they are represented. And it's just a normalized experience. We see this too in movies, in books, in book characters, in the advertisements, in products that are sold. And I think representation definitely has changed. I'm not trying to say that nothing has changed, because things have changed. But I would say that people of color are still not represented in the way that white people are, and that contributes, especially to that second point there, about whose perspective represents reality. All right, I'd like to read a quote here from Dr. Peggy McIntosh. She's a scholar and a researcher whose work includes anti-racism activism. This quote resonated with me. It's from her piece, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. That's available for free online if you want to Google that. This quote also, and what she writes, aligns with critical race theory, which again understands the white, or it takes the perspective that the white experience is normative, and all other experiences are measured against that. So Peggy McIntosh says, my schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor, as an unfairly advantaged person, or as a participant in a damaged culture. I was taught to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on her individual moral will. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us. So in line with in line with the previous slide, this is the idea of how whites, and Peggy McIntosh and myself, how we learned about this white fragility and white privilege. The last thing I want to talk about in part one is the idea of colorblind racism. So Dr. Bonilla Silva talked about colorblind racism in the video. I want to come back to that for a moment here. So colorblind racism is the idea that, I know this definition is not, it's kind of clunky, but it's the idea that when we ignore race as an important factor in daily life, the idea of, oh, I don't see race, I see people. This idea is actually racist because it ignores historical and social factors of accumulated disadvantage. I remember, I will never forget this, the first time that I talked about this when I was teaching. And I had a student who was so mad at me because he said, what do you mean it's racist to treat all my friends the same? And I said, oh, hold on. That is not what I'm saying. I am not saying that you should treat your friends differently. Absolutely not. I hope that everyone treats their friends with kindness and respect evenly across the board. So it is not racist to want to treat people equally. Not what I'm saying. What I am saying is this last point here, that when we choose to ignore the historical and social factors of accumulated disadvantage experienced by non-whites and expect people to have equal achievement outcomes, that's what's racist about it. That's what's racist about the statement of, I don't see race, I see people. So it's that ignorance to the realities that people face based on the color of their skin. So this is the end of part one, and it is now time for you to move on to part two of the video.